He wrote about Purim-related things. And there in chapter 10, he writes that he starts by quoting someone very recently who wrote about this Purim, and goes on to say that whoever wrote this clearly was not familiar with the article by the chief rabbi of Denmark. His name was David Simonson, lived about 100 years ago or so. He wrote an article in a journal in French 100 years ago or so where he argued that Saragossa is not Saragossa in Spain at all. It's actually referring to Syracuse, the original Syracuse, which is in Italy, southern Sicily. And he says, if you look in the Ksavim from those days, you'll see that Syracuse was referred to in Hebrew as Saragusa. Last year when we spoke about reading the Megillah in other languages, so it actually had to do with Rivash. Rivash lived in Saragossa. We noted that the way it was written is Sarkasta. That was Saracosta. That was how, at least at that time, it was written in Hebrew, which is a bit different than Saragossa or Saragusa. And this Simonson, when he wrote about it, he says, so the way he understands it is the descendants of those Jews who had been expelled from Sicily in the 1490s, and they ended up in Salonika in Greece and Smyrna in Turkey. They're the ones who are still celebrating this Chag. And other scholars after him, if you look it up, a lot of them seem to accept that it's if anything, it's Syracuse, not Saragossa. We know that in the 1800s, not too long ago, we have evidence that they were celebrating this Chag there, B'Poel Mamish in Yerushalayim. Someone in the 1880s printed the Megillah in Yerushalayim and said, we have people here that celebrate it. The way he writes it is, they celebrate it here just like they celebrate it back home in Saragossa. But clearly he didn't actually research and figure out where Saragossa is and whether they're Jews there right now. He just, there were Jews in Yerushalayim who were observing it. Then later in the 1910s, another person printed the text of the Megillah. And later he mentions that there's this minhag still in Yerushalayim. And as late as the 1930s, there was someone, Yitzchak Badhav, who describes how he grew up and they would do this. And even he was still keeping the tradition going in Yerushalayim as late as the 1930s. But there are questions about the text of this Megillah. There are questions about the story, and Horowitz's conclusion is that the other Purims that we know of that are documented are from the 1500s. Cairo, Crete, Algiers, that's when you start seeing Maisim Shahayu and Purim's beginning. He says the earliest mention and the earliest copy of this Megillah that we know about, of Megillah Saragossa, is all from the 1700s. Bit mysterious. So his conclusion is that maybe there were a group of people that felt left out. They have a Purim. Well, that's his supposition. He contrasts that with Purim Cairo, where we know the history of the story happened, and it's mentioned not too long afterwards. Even there, he gets into some of the details, and he has ha'aris. So it looks like we're starting up with the famous story, the famous holiday. I hope it's okay to challenge Purim Saragossa. But interestingly, I saw that 10 years ago or so, someone printed a little sefer called Purim Saragossa Ba'alocha Ba'agada. He got a scamas. Looks like he's trying to maybe rekindle some interest in this topic. Because at this point, it seems like all of these types of Purims have been forgotten. They're not really observed anymore. So he mentions, there's other people say other things. He doesn't want to get into that. He's, not very happy about this whole phenomenon of people asking questions about it. But even he mentions that in the Tafresh Mems, someone printed a sefer in Algiers and writes that he heard a story that happened in Livorno in Italy. Against the same Maisa that they used to, when the king and the queen, they would meet them, they would take the Sefer Torah out. Then at some point, they had a close call. And then he even concludes and says, and that's why in Livorno, they stopped using cases. So they figured, forget the whole case, let's just stick to, the Ashkenazi minhag of just the mantle. So even he acknowledges that it seems like the story on its own, without a Purim attached to it, seemed to travel around. Anyway, whoever's interested in knowing about Purim and Saragossa, Palmamish, so like I said, last year we spoke about the Tshuvas of the Rivash and Iran. That's Indian and Halacha that was written at the time that's related to Saragossa. Now, that's just the Maimon HaMuzkar. Now, there are, let's say, dozens of other examples of these types of Purims. Most of them seem to be from Sephardi countries, a few from Ashkenazi countries. Some are more famous, some are less. And indeed, it seems like it started Taka in the 1500s, and as we shall see in a moment from the main Shuvah on the topic. And this Horowitz Taka writes later on, when did this thing start? So the first ones we know about are Cairo and Crete. The Maisa in Cairo happened in 1524, although the first mention of the Purim is 30 years later. And by then, we have evidence that Purim in Crete from 1538 was already observed for about 10 years. And then you start seeing it spreading to Algiers. They had something they called Purim Edoim, when the king of Spain's attack failed. And Morocco had one. They often tend to revolve around incidents like this. There was a war, a battle. A battle could have been very destructive. We know from contemporary events how destructive a war could be on a local community, even when they're not perhaps directly the target. And so you start seeing many instances of these observances spreading around this time. And then a bit later, we see the first major one in European countries, Ashkenazim. That's the one in Frankfurt, known as Purim Vincent or Purim Fetmilch. Vincent's Fetmilch had started a rebellion against the government, and the Jews were caught in the middle. And in the end, he was captured and punished, and that was a big deal at the time. So that's Purim Frankfurt. And as we shall see, the Chassam Sofer, who was originated from Frankfurt, was very proud of this minhag that he grew up with. So that's in the 1640s, I believe. 1614, 1616. So that seems to be when this idea surfaced and started spreading. And then by the time you get to the end of the 1800s, like I said, there are dozens of them, big and small. But I wanted to get into the halachic side of this inyan. What is the halachic basis for creating a new Purim, a Yom Tov like this? And to some extent, what does this say about potential celebrations nowadays for things that happened more recently? And b'chlal, takanas. What is the power of takanas? So the main source on this topic that everyone's been assigned to is Shut Maharam Al-Ashkar Siman Memtes. So just Bekitzer Maharam Al-Ashkar, Moshe Al-Ashkar was born in the 1460s in Spain, was expelled from Spain, ended up in Tunis. At some point, Spain caught up with them there. He ended up moving to Libya, to Greece, to Mitzrayim, and then at the end of his life, he passed away in Eretz Yisrael in 1542. His tshuvas, many of them are fairly chashuv and famous. So in Siman Memtes, we find the following shaila. It starts off lepanto. We'll explain what that is in a second. Shaila. So anshe ir achas hemu beis dinam tiknu beineim b'charomes u'b'haskama gedola aleim b'alzaram b'al boim achareim me'ata v'adoilam. So some community, the people and the Beis Din together made a takana, but not just a takana, because in those days everything came with cherem and as many powerful things that can strengthen their takanas. And it wasn't just for them, it was alzaram me'ata v'adoilam, that Yud Aleph Tevis should be Ki Yoim Purim L'chol Dvarav. That's the lashon. We should treat it mamish like Purim in all respects. Why? To publicize a big nest that happened. Doesn't specify. And part of the takana included that even if you move and you go live somewhere else, the takana can never leave you. You always have to observe this takana. So Yoira Hamoira, please tell us, do the Anshe Ir Achas have the power to be matakin something like this or not? And if the takana is a takana, meaning generally, just basically, can you be matakin a Purim? And if you can, Can they be geyser al ba'am achareim? Can they make sure that it goes on for posterity? And if they can, but now they've all been expelled from that city, and now they've all settled into other cities and even other kingdoms. Does that haskama follow them wherever they go, or not? Now, not many details here. All we know is the first word. The first word is Lepanto. Lepanto is a place. Lepanto today is known as Nafpaktos in Greece. It's near the coast. Back in the day, we know there were a lot of wars taking place in that area. The Italians, the Turks were fighting over these territories. And so we know Lepanto was controlled by Venice in the 1400s, and they called it Lepanto, so that's where the name Lepanto is known from. And then the Turks captured it in 1499. There was a big battle in 1571 where they fought over it. And it mostly stayed under Ottoman control until Greece finally became independent much, much later. Now, you look around, you look at the people that make lists of Purims, so a lot of people assume that the Purim relates to a nest, to some kind of rescue, right? We said many of them are battle related, so it must have been one of these battles with regards to Lepanto. And in fact, I've seen many sources write, it was in 1571. But it's obvious that it can't have been in 1571, because Maram al-Ashkar was asked about it, and Maram al-Ashkar passed away in 1542, so obviously can't be that. I found a handbook of JLI that writes, for instance, the Greek city of Lepanto was seized from the Venetians by the Ottomans in 1499. Okay, so they use 1499. That can work. There's no surviving description of the danger and rescue, just that there was a Purim Lepanto on Yud Aleph Tevis. We know this because of Maram al-Ashkar. The problem with that still is, so they moved the date back, but the problem still is that the Shuvah says, Ata shegershu kula me'oisa ir, v'nitmu ba'yoras acheres v'malchus acheres, and he's writing to Lepanto. So how could it be Purim Lepanto, and he's writing to them, but they're expelled? So I found, seemingly only in one place, the same Meir Benayahu we mentioned previously, who's a big expert on this part of the world in this period. So he writes, one of his Sfarim that he printed, he writes about these cities in Greece. He writes about Lepanto, that Lepanto grew from the destruction of the city of Patras. He says, Moshe al-Ashkar was asked from Lepanto about a city that celebrated Yud Aleph Tevis, and now they were all expelled. And he writes in parentheses, Bevadai mipatras lilepanto. He doesn't know for sure, but that's his supposition. And it makes more sense, because we know that Patras, he writes further on, that Patras around the year 1500 was changed hands between the Venetians and the Turks, and we know that Patras Taka was very much destroyed at that point. And we have many other tshuvas describing how the people from Patras came to Lepanto and the problems that caused with taxes and things like that. So, just for the record, to understand what the history behind the Shaila was, makes more sense to say that if anything we should call it Purim Patras, and they must have been saved during one of the wars around this time, and they wanted to celebrate it, and then they got expelled, and they wanted to continue celebrating it. They wanted to keep their identity even when they were in Lepanto. Now, if you pay attention to the dates, if we say it was around the year 1500, that means this might make it the earliest of these Purims, because we said the earliest Purims that we know about are from 1530s, 1520s. So this might move the date back a bit. He doesn't address Maram al-Ashkar. He doesn't discuss this source, but at least it makes sense. If you were asking why he's the first one to talk about it, it seems like Itaka Mamish started with around this time with this Shaila. So now the question is, back to the Shaila and the Tshuva. What's the story with this Purim? So Maram al-Ashkar responds as follows: Tshuva, surely Bnei Yair can make takanas and haskamis and gedorim and knossos, all manner of takanas that they can placed on themselves, on the members of the community, even if it's not even al-pi din Torah. So it's quoting from Gemaras, Baba Basra, Rashoim b'nei ha'ir, lahasnes al-hamidus, v'al-hasharim. These are financial related matters, but it's understood that a city has the power to make rules. Quotes Tesafta, different examples. B'nei Umnas, even B'nei Umnas in a city can gather together and set rules that are binding for them. Quotes different Makaitis to this effect. These Makaitis also mention that Dafka, if there's an Adam Chashuv, that there's also an Adam Chashuv involved in the Takana. But if there's no Adam Chashuv, then who are they? But then he goes and says, but B'nei Ir Achas, if it's a city, even if there's no Adam Chashuv, it seems that they could make Takanas and it's binding. And this is what it seems from the Rambam and the Ramban, that when it mentions Adam Chashuv, that's B'nei Umnas. Only if people of a trade make rules and they need Adam Chashuv to strengthen it. But Anshe Ir, they don't need anybody's agreement, they don't need anybody's stamp of approval. Just as Rosh Ir and Anshe Ir, they can get together and set rules. They don't need Askamas Adam Chashuv Be'ir. Kol Shekain, Heimu Beis Dinam, if the Beis Din is involved, all the better. So that's of course relevant to this question where we said it was them and Beis Dinam. He goes on to say, there are a lot of inyanim here that are yisaidistic in this whole tchum of takanas. So it's one way of familiarizing with oneself with these ideas. He says, even to be mafkir moment, it belongs to someone. You want to be mafkia the moment, mafkir the moment, they can do that. It's a Gemara, it says, Minola de mafkirin and nechse, how do we know you can do that? Brings a pasuk, that if you don't come on time, yechram kol rechushay. And of course we have with Shemitah, the idea being that be'emes, Shemitah, I think the maskana is that Shemitah is mashmit ksaf from deraisa. But Hill was mataken, the light tashmit, hefker based in hefker. So you have a chayiv biyad aloive, zacha boy min ha-Torah, and Chachamim can take it away and give it to the Malva b'pruzbul. Obviously that's Chachamim, but he's taking from that even Anshe Ir have this power. He quotes a Rambam in Hilchas Sanhedrin that yesh l'dayan lahafker moment sheyesh le'bailim, that if there's a good reason for it, a dayan is able to grab people's property, confiscate it. Everyone agrees to this. And the Rashba wrote that Tzibur kebeis din shel bnei Yiramein, the Tzibur and the Beis Din, they both have the same power. So getting back to the topic at hand, so Kol Shekain over here, Tiknu Takanasam, Heim U Beis Dinam, both the Tzibur and the Beis Din, and there's nothing against them, Torah Adrabah, Presumei Nisa. What else should you be metaken if not this? Takanas of a Sikani, it's a great takana. We see that Chacham were metaken a bracha even for a Yachid. Harei Makam Shenasal Lebei Nes, and a Baruch She'asli Min Nes Makam Hazeh. So being metaken something like this, Gavaldik. What about the length? How long does the takana like this last? So he says, Yechelin Gam Kenan She'irachas L'takein Al Kol HaBoyim Achareim Ad Seif Kol HaDeiros. And that's even if they didn't spell it out. Tiknu Stam, they didn't mention their children. It's for sure Chal Al Zaram Al Zera Zaram. Where do we see this? The Ma'aseh of Pilegesh Begiva. The Ma'aseh of Pilegesh Begiva, by the time they were through, they swore that Ish Mimenu Layitin Bitoy LeBinyamin Leisha. We're not letting Binyamin marry our daughters. And we see that they kept to it, they stuck to it, Gamma Deiros Aboyim, until at some point they came and they darshan and they said, we said Ish Mimenu Layitin Bitoy. So Mimenu V'Loi Mibanenu. They came and they reevaluated the whole Gzeira. So Kumtais, that if they hadn't said this word Mimenu, which allowed for this drasha, if they had said Ishla Yitain, then they would be stuck, there would be no way out, there would be Chal Al Deiros Aboyim. Kol Shekain, if they would say Mimenu Mizareinu, then there would be nothing you could do about it. And this is like the Gzeira of Yeshua ben Nun. Yeshua ben Nun said, Order Ish Oshayakam Yivnes Yerichai, and we see that the curse carries over many, many years. And it didn't spell out, it was stamped. He quotes the Ramban. One of the Ramban's smaller works is called Mishpat HaCherem, where the Ramban is trying to explain how these things work. And the Rabbi, he quotes the Ramban as saying, Sheken adin b'chol kabbalas harabim, the Rabbim is makabel something, it's chal on them, al zaram, like we see with kabbalas haTorah. How does kabbalas haTorah work? It all comes down to some sort of agreement. We're all coming together and agreeing that something is binding. B'chein b'megillah, u'b'tzaymis, it's all essentially the same mechanism, so the same mechanism continues to work. Not only that, even if there was no official declaration, there was no kiblu aleim b'nei irba askama. Let's say they just started on their own. There was a geder, a siag l'Torah. It's also binding for the people afterwards. So, for example, in Perek Makom Shenagu, it says that b'nei Beishan, which is short for Beis Sha'an, they wouldn't go from Tzur to Tzidon on Erev Shabbos. Shouldn't shter with Chanas to Shabbos. And they came to Rabbi Yechon and they said, this worked for our ancestors, but we can't handle this, we need to be able to go. There was a market, whatever it was. And he said, for kiblu aleim avesechem, uksiv, shma b'ni musar avicha. So it sounds like there's nothing you could do about it. There wasn't even an official event where they declared this as a gzeira still. So we also find the Megillas Tainus, and it's brought in B'kol Ma'arvin, that Amar Elazar Tzaddik, and I am from, in Tainus you have about the carbon eitzim. They used to bring the eitzim, the different families had this tradition, they had their date every year, they would bring the eitzim, it was a big simcha. So Elazar Tzaddik says, I'm descendant of the family that does it on Yud Av. That's the date. And once Tisha B'Av fell out on Shabbos, so the fast was Nidche to Sunday Yud Av. So now, do we fast or do we do our family Yom Tov? So he said, we fasted, but we weren't mashlim the fast. What's pshat? So he says, their ancestors had the Geirel Carbon Eitzim and Asar B'Av, V'mei Ezra. The whole thing started in V'mei Ezra Taka when those families actually came and gave wood and it was needed. And then they just turned into an annual tradition, a Yom Tov every year. And Agav, there's just the Parshas Vayikra, there's a Sikha from the Rebbe on this Inyan in Chelik Chav Beis, Vayikra Beis. Very beautiful Hezber on the Inyan of carbon eitzim, the significance of carbon eitzim. Oh, it's the ultimate bittul. And Elazar Reb Tzaddik lived b'chal after the Churban, right? He's fasting on Tisha B'Av, he's after the Churban. But because his Zaydus used to bring the carbon eitzim on that day, and it was a family Yom Tov, so even when the Beis HaMikdash is gone and the eitzim are gone, but the Yom Tov stays for the family. Ad kadei kach, that it's overriding Tisha B'Av Nidcha. And it's just a minig ba'alma. And we see the power, and we see that Nagu boy abanim ad olam. So, Ein Tzarech Leimar, back to here, that they're machrim and the takana, and they included zarim as a zarim b'feidish, shechala, agzeira, aleim ad olam. So that's his stance, that's his take on the takana itself. It's just as powerful as all these things in Chazal, there's no difference. What about the question about the fact that now they all were expelled, they ended up somewhere else? So he gets into the whole Inyan of Noisnol of Chumri Amakim, Shiyatz Misham, Shahach L'Shem, how does it work? He says the maskana from these sugyas in the Gemara is that it all depends essentially what your intentions are. If you move somewhere and your intention is to stay there, not to return, then all your manhagim are transformed to match the place where you moved to, l'chumra and l'kula. And me'edach, if you plan on returning to your original location, then all the chumras and kulas of your original location stick to you. Brings examples from Chulin. In Chulin it says that Abzeira and Eretz Yisrael ate the mugremes, hagrama and shchita. So the machlekes, if you're allowed to eat it or not. So in Eretz Yisrael, they were mater. And Bavel, Rav and Shmuel answered. He moved to Eretz Yisrael, he started being mater. Mara says, no, that's of Daite Lachzer, in Daite Lachzer. So he took on the kulas of Eretz Yisrael. Reb Zera. But if he had planned on going back, then it would be the reverse. He would follow Mirin Mekayma Afil L'Akal. Where do we see that? In Perek Makom Shenag, Rabbi Bar Chana, when he came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he ate a certain shuman, a certain chaylev that in Eretz Yisrael they were mater, and in Bavel they used to aser. What about Chumni Makom Shehalach L'Sham? No, Daite Lachzer La'artzei. So he was mekel if where he came from. Now the question is, why did they aser this in Bavel? What's the level of Isser that he's ignoring because he's still following Minhag Yisrael? So the Rosh ben Tshuva writes that it wasn't even a psageder, it was mamash they held was min adin and min atayra. The Rosh writes that it was a minhag chashuv, al pi tamid chachamim, not quite that level. And the Rosh concludes in this discussion, the Rosh concludes and says, this idea that if you move somewhere, you follow, and you're planning on moving there, then it's bein l'kula, bein l'chumra, like Reb Zera, he adopted the minhagim Eretz Yisrael. And the reverse, Rabbi Bar Chana, because he was planning on going back, he followed the chumras and kulas of where he came from. But dafka b'tzina, chaylev is no one knows which part of the meat you're eating at home. So for hestia, you don't want to cause friction. It's a different discussion. He quotes Taran. Taran says, whether you say it was the chaylev that they didn't eat in Bavel, whether you say it was a chumrah, whether it was, they held it was Medina, but either way, he clearly was mekel. The Ran says, we see from here that in Taidas HaMinhagas, when it comes to the union of Minhagim, any minhag that's aser in one place, as long as it's not a minhag batos, which is its own category, whether it's a siyag or it's a machlekes, and they paskin like the ones who aser, so you're chayiv min adin to follow that minhag of psak. And if you leave and you plan on coming back, you're still mechayev to that. If you move somewhere else, then you lose your old city isn't binding anymore. So minhag batos, then that's a different story. So Zok the Maram al-Ashker. So based on this whole vert, so Misha Akar Dirasai Meir Achas V'Kol Be'er Acheres. So it sounds like Take, all the takanas are nifka. Even a Dovid shel Isser, Mamish Yisurim. So Kol Shikein a Minig She'ein Bei Shum Isser, like here, it's a Purim. So it would seem that once they moved, puff, the Purim is gone. Why should their haskama be more chamer than an Isser Hagrama Shel Torah? Even Isser Hagrama Shel Torah, it all depends on whether you're fully moving or not. But then he backs off of that and he says, Hayois, it said, befedish in their haskama, that even if they change their place, the takana doesn't go off. So then, whatever they said is binding. Because you can we said earlier that you can be matakin whatever you want for your children, your descendants, and it's binding. So why not include that as well? That could also be binding. Well, that's its own question. That's its own historical question and where that comes from. Someone here asked me about it recently. First marker we have about it is like 150 years ago. It's not it's a classic example of something that's clear-cut and mefedish. But yeah, something like that. And it says, anyway, we can be mechalik between this and the Megremes, because there you could say that Reb Zera held it was mutter all along. It was noeg Isser b'Bavel because he wanted to follow Rav and Shmuel. The second he came to Eretz Yisrael, he was able to finally act himself and do what he really thought, what he really felt. So he never felt it was really binding for him. Here, they accepted it as binding for them. So Ebazai, even when you leave the city, you're going to say, Nikra Gzar Dinam, Yum Slakim and Acherim. Why should that change all of a sudden? So therefore, Hilchach, even if this Tanah had not been written, there would probably have to be Mekaymek B'chol Makim, like Reb Elazar ben Reb Tzadok, back to the families with the Korban Eitzim. So after the Churban, they probably lived somewhere else. They still kept the family minig. So you see that it follows you around. So Kol Shekain, when it was mamish in the haskama that it's chal for everyone, forever, wherever, then it's binding. Who's the big bar plukta of Maram al-Ashkar? So the big bar plukta is the Pri Chadash. Pri Chadash lived in the second half of the 1600s in Eretz Yisrael. Last time I spoke about his Shver. His Sefer Pri Chadash is well known. So in Simon Tov Tzadik Vav, where it talks about Yontif Shel Galias, so the Shulchan Aruch mentions Eretz Yisrael, Chutz La'aretz, that whole parsha. So he says, oh, this is an opportunity to talk about this whole topic of minhagi Isser. You have a minhag of Isser, how does it apply, when does it apply? So he has a tremendous arichas there. Maybe in the next installment we'll be able to get to other details. But here, we're just going to focus on Sif Yadalet. He says, you have Yechidim b'dereinu, that Nisim, they make it a Yom Tov L'Deiris. Chayim Mitzrayim, Oid hayoyim erelam nes gadol shekavu oisa yemishtu v'simcha l'deiros shivas maramalashka yirav tevis. So we need to know, is there a basis for this or not? So he starts off by quoting about Megillas Tainis, and there's this word there that af onu mechab v'nes atzares of a man nasa shem banu lichtev ein onu maspikin. There are too many tzares, too many atzalas. So his first impression is that if you want to be mechabev the tzaris and the shevach la'kadosh baruch Hu, then you can make a yom tov. And Rebbe Zoid should have the power to be doiche tisha b'av nidcha, and he quotes that whole inyan. But then he says, acharei and nira, that no, these are all to the shus. Stam, people are getting together and having a party, it's very nice, it's to the shus, and they can't be doiche anything. That even if you did it a few years, you can stop at any point without hatara, and the children surely don't have to continue it if they never want to makabel it, because it's a minig batos. Whoa, how did he get from here to there? He says, because it says in Rosh Hashanah, the Batla Megillas Tainis. So Bazai, sounds like all of these types of, Megillas Tainis was full of these types of special days, exciting days, things that happened during Bayis Sheni. Sounds like that whole category is Batal. Can't say, oh, maybe those are Batal, but now we can add new ones. Because no, the Gemara talks about, it says that in Gimel Tishrei, they stopped mentioning Hashem's name in the Shtaris, and that was a good thing. They didn't want Hashem's name to be rolling around. So they made it a Yom Tov. The Gemara says, we're Revatal, the early ones, and now we're adding new ones. So from the Gemara's Kasha, you see that the Gemara is Mufrach, that if you're Revatal the old ones, you can add new ones. So whatever you're adding is just your own personal party, it's to the Shus. And this is all Pukim and Amalashka, which he wrote, that it's Mamish, so powerful, it's like Elazar ben Tzadok. He says, no, Elazar ben Tzadok, he holds Lei Batal Megillas Tainis, it's a whole different shitta, and that's not how we paskin, so Mamela, there are no such things, there are no Yom Tovim, and that's it. And yeah, it's in the Chalak ben Yochid L'Rabim, which would be the same thing. However, you look in Yabia Omer, Ravad Yosef, Chilik Yud, the Chaim Simon and Gimel, he rounds up other Achrayim who talk about this. Chaim Abulafia lived around the same time. He says, no, the Gemara is talking about for Gans Klal Yisrael. Yeah, Taka, there's no Megillas Tainis, Batla. We can't make something that's binding for Klal Yisrael. But a specific tzibur, you could be mechalek and say that a tzibur could create a binding day. And the Chida accepts this as well. The Chassam Sofer, when he talks about Purim Frankfurt, makes this point as well. That's pretty much that discussion. Let me conclude another minute or two. Today, the direction this discussion has gone in is mainly Yom Ha'atzmaut, these types of days in a week. Can you say Hal, you not say Hal? I don't want to get into that. B'chlal and Chabad, we know we don't hold of adding new days of celebration, Stam Hazoi, and we happen to notice that all of these old Purims have expired with time. None of them seem to have lasted. But Pashtos, the word is that we don't just celebrate good things. Every celebration has to have a ruchnistic significance, which Torah describes, which Torah explains to us. So if there's a ruchnistic significance, then Mela, we celebrate. But Stam, because we're happy, because we feel safe, that's not the reason. On the other hand, Dafka Chabad is also famous for, pretty legendary, for having many of its own new Yom Tovim celebrating this and that. And in fact, it seems like Yutas Kislev, to begin with, maybe Taka had a bit more in mind this old concept of Purim. You see, they wrote up some Megillas Yutas Kislev. And Dafka, when it comes to our special days, the Rabbeim explained Dafka, there's very much a ruchnistic significance. The Rabbi Shuchat pointed out to me that there's a sikh of the Rebbe, Masei, Tavshin Chav Zayin, right after the 6-day war. And the Rebbe says, that's Vada, Grace and Nes, we can't say otherwise, right? That was a big Yisur by the Rebbe, that was a big Nes. Chas v'shalom, though, to make it a Yom Tov, how we can add Yom Tovim, the Rebbe says. Because in Kabbalah it explains that Yom Tovim correspond to the Sviris, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot are Chagas, and Chanukah, and Purim, and Netzach, and Hoid, and Kayudua, there's 2 days, which one is which? And Lasid Lavai, it says Shivas B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av Yisayid and Malchus. So there's a seder, there's a system. You can't just add real Yom Tovim, Isser Malacha, Midas Halel. Alright, what about Yud Beis Tammuz? The Rebbe says, Staku Yom Chag Gulas Yisrael, and Lo Yisrael B'Vad Gal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, etc. But no one, it never occurred to anyone to say Hal even without a bracha. And the Rebbe says it's a pratistic Yom Tov, like we find Gedel Yisrael that made a personal Yom Tov for them, for their mishpacha. We see the Chidah quotes from the Rambam, different letters that are attributed to the Rambam, that he was Kevei Yom Tovim for his descendants. We know the Tosfos Yom Tov, I think maybe even the Chassam Sefer quotes it, made for his descendants. So the Rebbe says that's the category Yud Beis Tammuz is in. So Mamela, we see the Rebbe addressing this. I think it's really the two things together. Sai, we're not making it into a full proper Yom Tov. But Purim, these Purims are not a full proper Yom Tov. So, but even that, you have to figure out what the exact Hagdara would be. We're giving it a realistic significance, and we're saying that it's a private thing, more or less in the category of those types of Purims, but we're not calling it that quite that. And the next installment, I'd like to discuss what we can learn from this, Lagabe, the question Bechlal of the power of Takanas and how or whether they can expire.